Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Stavros Niarchos Foundation Brain Insight lecture of this academic year. I hope you're doing well. We were hoping to have this event already in person, but given the current public health situation, we continue to have it virtually. Hopefully next spring, we'll have some events in person. But thankfully, many of you can join us tonight virtually that maybe couldn't be here in person. So let's make the best out of this situation. Tonight, we're in for a treat. I'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for the continuous support of this lecture series and the Teacher Scholars Program, and many of the members of the foundation that are here tonight. And tonight, you'll be treated to a wonderful presentation by two Columbia faculty, and a discussion and conversation that will be led by Dr. Anne Loeffler from the Zuckerman Institute. Anne is a postdoctoral researcher in the sensory motor learning group at the Zuckerman Institute. She received a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCL in London in 2018 and joined Daniel Wolpert's lab at the Zuckerman Institute in January 2019 as a postdoctoral fellow. Her research focuses on the highly dynamic neurocognitive processes that exactly shape decisions and their implementation into movement, into then the action. And so no one else better than Anne to lead us through our journey today into how do brains decide, create, and innovate, which, as you see, is a lofty topic. Before I turn it over to Anne, I want to thank everyone that submitted questions ahead of time, and remind you that if you have a question during this session, please type it in the Q&A, and we'll then introduce it into the conversation. So thank you all, and I'd like to welcome Anne here. Please, Anne, lead us in.
Thank you very much, Rui, for your kind introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce today's virtual event on how our brains decide, create, and innovate. Decision-making is one of the most complex processes that occurs in our brains, and there are many open questions that neuroscientists and psychologists are trying to answer. For example, how do we make decisions? Are the decisions that we make rational? And how can we understand how our brains decide, and how can we harness those processes to unlock our own creativity? These questions are very closely related actually to my own research, in which I investigate the brain mechanisms underlying decision-making. I am particularly interested in how the human brain combines different pieces of information in order to decide what to do. This includes sensory information from the environment, but also internal information such as our own intentions, preferences, memories, and emotions. All of these factors influence the choices we make in our daily lives. For example, simple decisions about what to cook for dinner, but also more complex and impactful decisions about, for example, what field of study to pursue. In my work, I combine behavioral experiments, neuroimaging techniques, and computational modeling in order to gain new insights into how the brain integrates these multiple sources of information to guide our decisions and ultimately our actions. So today we will be hearing from Dr. Mike Shadlin and Dr. Sheena Iyengar, two experts who take different but complementary approaches to researching decision-making and how it affects our lives. In this event, we will hear two 15-minute talks, one from each of our experts, and afterwards I will moderate a discussion between the speakers. As part of this discussion, we will also include questions from you, our audience. So if you have already submitted a question, thank you very much. If you wish to still submit a question while the talks are in progress, please look for the Q&A button to submit your questions to the panelists. And please let us know if you're a teacher or a student. And if you're a student, please tell us what grade you're in. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Mike Shadlin. Dr. Mike Shadlin is a professor of neuroscience and principal investigator at Columbia Zuckerman Institute. He studies the neurobiology of decision-making and has made fundamental contributions to this field by combining behavior, electrophysiology, and computational methods. In his lab, Dr. Shadlin studies how we turn visual signals into behavior. He focuses on the brain's parietal cortex, a region that acts as a go-between, linking areas that take in sensory input to those that prepare the body to act. Dr. Shadlin started his career as a physician, but was drawn to the lab because there were so many gaps in what we knew about the brain. He hopes that his work to decipher the fundamental components of cognition will one day help treat people with disorders, ranging from schizophrenia to autism to dementia. And as a postdoc in his lab, I have had the pleasure to work together with Dr. Shadlin, and I can attest to him being an incredibly supportive mentor and dedicated teacher, in addition to being such a successful researcher. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shadlin to the virtual stage for his talk, Decision-Making as a Model of Thought.
Okay, can you hear me? Someone let me know if I'm heard. Great, and you can see my slide?
Yes.
Great, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and those last words you mean a great deal to me. So thank you for touching my heart. Okay, so let's see, how shall I begin? Well, 9 years ago, at a ceremony celebrating Mort Zuckerman's gift to endow the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute, Mort asked this question, whoops. What is the form and content of a thought in the brain? I've been thinking about that for about 50 years, and this is the first time I'm going to try and answer that in public. And so let's have a little bit of fun tonight, and I'll try and keep this as informal as possible, just burdening you ever so slightly with some neuroscience. So here's the thing. I'm going to answer this question, I hope, in the next 14 minutes, and it's going to be based on the neuroscience of decision-making. And then I'll add in there what's the difference between a thought that we experience consciously and one that occurs without conscious awareness. And as a dividend, try to reconcile what turns out to be a very rational brain, as I'll convince you in a moment, with the irrational propensities of its owner. And I'll do that without any reference to politics, except for right now. Okay, so in the lab, we study decision-making because we view it as a window on higher brain function in general. And as Anne mentioned, we think that really, well, what I think is that decision-making carves cognition at its joints. And those joints are the joints that fail in dementia and other disorders that affect the mind. And I'll give you a little bit of a feel for that as we go along. Okay, and I'm at the Zuckerman Institute. We use mouse, monkey, humans, and one day maybe collaborate with our fly colleagues to try and understand this at a variety of levels, because ultimately we would like to understand what the human brain does in a language, in a biological language that will be addressable in disease. That's a hope. So now, our first insight really comes from a neurological perspective, that thoughts are structured as interrogation, using a term that kind of resonates with decision-making. The brain basically poses questions and answers them with evidence from the senses and from memory. And those questions are posed as possible behaviors. I know this seems to run counter to the current trend to think about the brain as like a computer doing information processing. That's just not how the brain works, though. It asks questions of the world, gets answers, and that's how it knows. So an insight from neurology that I'd like to share comes from patients that have what's called parietal neglect. So this is the blue here, is you're looking at a brain on the right side. So this is the right hemisphere of a brain, and this blue is the parietal lobe. And it and the temporal lobe, which I'm outlining with my mouse, assuming you can see that, are the areas of the brain that when you lose them, you have something called agnosia, which is the loss of knowledge. In the Greek, gnosis means knowledge. And so what happens to parietal patients is that they not only don't know about the left side of the world, like asked to draw this clock, copy it, and draw from memory, or copy these other images. They kind of tend to neglect things on the left side of the world, or even the left side of other things in the world. It's not just half of the visual field. And the thing is that they don't know this. And they're exactly unlike a patient that has lost vision maybe because of a stroke in the right visual cortex who comes to the doctor complaining that they can't see very well. But the parietal patient, what they really lack is the part of the brain that asks questions about the world. Is that some place I might want to look at? Is that some place I might touch on my body? And so forth. And they lack awareness of the objects of those questions. But that's because they lack the ability to ask the question in the first place. So let's take a closer look at the parietal lobe by looking at another image of a drawing of a monkey brain. This is the same, a smaller brain, but this has the same parietal regions. And we see that it's parcellated into little subgroups of areas. And each area has a partner in the front of the brain that actually kind of controls the behavior. When you lose the front part of the brain, you get things like paralysis and apraxia, the inability to organize movements. But back here in the parietal lobe, what you lose is knowledge. You don't have knowledge about the world. Okay, and one of these areas cares about where we look, like it talks to the front part of the brain that moves the eyes around. Another part, how we reach. Another part, say how we might hold our hand to grab an object if we felt like doing it. And so, and I would argue that these actually contain or hold on to knowledge of the world in the form of an answer to the question, might I? And then fill in the blank. Might I reach? Might I walk between these two things? If we're talking about the temporal lobe, we might say, might I eat this? Might I come back to this path that I rejected the first time I saw that T-junction? And so on and so forth. These are all things that the body or of animals and us do in the world, but we're basically asking questions, looking for evidence that bears on whether we'll do that. Now, I realize I skipped the definition of a decision, but I might as well say it here. A decision is a commitment to a proposition based on evidence gathered mostly from the world through the senses, but also from memory stores inside the brain, and then and uses them and reaches through deliberation at least a provisional commitment to do something or to say something or just to believe in the proposition. So you can see how interrogation sort of fits right into that definition. Now let's look even closer and go inside the parietal lobe and to that part that communicates with the eye movement areas, and try to sample the electrical activity from just a single neuron in this area. This is an MRI of a monkey brain, and I'm just painting the part of the brains that we're interested in. Now, neurons don't make sounds, but they do make electrical activity, as I hope many of you know. And the nice thing about the electrical activity is that we can spy on the neuron with a little piece of metal, tiny, microscopic, and sample that electrical discharge from the one neuron and listen to it by just amplifying the electrical discharge into the loudspeaker. So let's see if you can hear spikes from a neuron while a monkey does a very simple memory task. He's asked to remember the location of that briefly flashed spot, and then ultimately he's going to make an eye movement there. So let's listen to the neuron as he does this very simple task. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you heard the spiking? Okay, I'm going to assume you all heard it. Yes?
We had.
Great, great. Okay, so this activity, what you heard are these little tick marks. Those are the spikes from the neuron. That's how a neuron communicates to other neurons. And what you can sort of see here and what you heard was an elevation in the discharge of the neuron after the light came on and off. And I would submit to you that is a thought. And the content of that thought in this case is something very simple, a non-conscious thought, a thought about the where of a really as yet to be analyzed object. But there's a certain thing about it, a certain awareness. I mean aware with the W, not awareness. We'll get to awareness, like conscious awareness, in a few minutes. But you're looking at what a thought is in the brain. And the interesting thing about thought is that it is flexible in time. It's what gives us our freedom from the immediate demands of processing a sensory world. So we don't have to obey it immediately, like bundles or bags of reflexes. We can deal with it on our own terms, in our own time. And similarly, we can control our bodies, which is a real-time engineering problem, but we can delay when we do that and control the pace at which we do things, all thanks to this kind of persistence in the brain. So if you ask me, the evolution of higher brain function and thought came with the emergence of that freedom from immediacy and persistence. Now, the neural activity that we're recording from these neurons in this part of the brain is spatially selective. And to illustrate that, if we flash the red spot over here, we no longer see that elevated discharge. Okay, and I'm going to suggest that this discharge is the outcome of something like a decision. And in fact, we can study decision making by exploiting the property of these neurons that they can tell us whether a monkey is going to think, for example, that this might be a better eye movement than this target being, say, more predictive of reward than this one. And we can do experiments where we give the monkey a reason to choose this over that, because he would choose this if he thought the net direction of these little flittering about dots tends to be blowing to the right as opposed to the left. It is blowing to the right. Okay? So it turns out that what I'm now going to try to convince you of, using a very different experiment, but an easy one to grasp, is that this persistent activity, which just looks like someone turned a switch on, is actually the substrate not just of on and off thinking or commitment, but actually the substrate of reasoning. So what we do is, in this experiment, is the two people I flashed up so quickly you barely saw them. Here you go. What we do? Whoa, are you kidding me? Please tell me that isn't a text thing. I'm done. No. Okay, I guess I'm getting close though. I can't see your text, by the way, Paula. I'm sorry. Anyway, so very quickly. I'm nervous that I'm running over time. Okay, the monkey is going to...
5 minutes.
What? How much?
5 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So the monkey is deciding whether reward is associated with this green target or this red target, and he's deciding it based on these shapes. So 5 shapes support probabilistically. They're not sure bets. They don't guarantee a reward at green, but they make a reward at green more probable. Similarly, these 5 shapes make a reward at red more probable. And you'll notice that some shapes are more reliable than others. Okay? So the idea is the monkeys, it turns out, can combine this probabilistic information to make the best possible decision. And so, for example, if they see weak evidence for red, followed by a triangle and Pac-Man and another Pac-Man, that might be weak evidence for red followed by mounting evidence for green, and it would, if the numbers were right, green might be more likely to give a reward than red. So let's listen to the discharge from a neuron, just like the ones I just showed you. And this happens to be a neuron that's interested in the area of space that's currently occupied by the red target. Okay, so on this trial, there was a shape that initially favored the red target. And look, that neuron cares about that red target, you might say, and there's an increase in the discharge. I hope you heard that. But then that was followed by a succession of shapes, triangle and 2 Pac-Men, that led to a evidence against the red and for the green target, and that was associated with this decrease in the activity, this decrescendo in the firing. Okay, let's look at another trial. Okay, so in this case, the first shape favored the green target outside this neuron's response field. Remember, the neuron cares about this red target, which is the one he ultimately chose. But then the next shapes gave mounting evidence for the red target. And you see that that's associated with this increase in the firing rate. You can tell the firing rate's increasing just visually, even if you didn't hear it very well, because you see this, the gaps between the spikes get narrower and narrower. It just like fills the field here. Let's one more trial. All right, so this one was even more interesting to me anyway. It starts out with evidence for the green target, which is now in this part this is the part of the visual field that this neuron cares about. So maybe there was a little bit of activity here, kind of hard to say. But then that's followed by this decrescendo again, as there's mounting evidence for red, and then finally a very strong evidence for green, which is ultimately the choice the animal made. And so now what we get the sense of is that these neurons are kind of doing a running addition and subtraction. They're increasing the response, they're decreasing the response, and they're doing a cumulative sum. And it turns out that what they're doing is computing something about the relative value of the two options. And what they're really doing is computing with numbers that turn out to bear a resemblance to what a statistician or an actuary would do, or an economist would do with information of different degrees of reliability. So they don't just represent an on or an off. They represent a degree of belief in a proposition. And for the students, these neurons are computing logarithms of ratios of probability. So when you learn these things in your math classes, your brain is doing it all the time so that you can actually learn. This interesting little circularity there. So the brain is rational. That's pretty important to realize. But you might wonder, why are humans so often irrational in their decision making? Okay, I'm going to try to answer that. So I'm going to give you two answers, okay? One is that through the lens of neuroscience, some seemingly irrational tendencies may in fact be rational. So I'll give you an example. Actually, this is something that Sheena made famous. It's a topic called choice overload that's very much associated with her work. And so economists tell us that it's rational to prefer more choices. You know, you'd like the store to have more brands of a jam. That's a famous example of hers. And then, but the observation that Sheena made, was that there are too many. When there's too many options, humans may forgo making any choice at all. They don't buy anything in the store, for example. And that seems irrational to the economist. Okay. Well, we did an experiment. Actually, Anne, who's moderating, did this experiment with a bunch of other colleagues, and we just asked humans, in this case, to make two decisions, to tell us what's the net direction of these moving dots, but also what's the dominant color. And what we found, and they have to answer both questions. So, you know, right and yellow, right and blue, left and yellow, left and blue. And what we found out, to make a long story short, is that the difficulty of either judgment didn't affect the performance on the other. They looked like they were performing this task in parallel, but they weren't. They were competing for the time. They could not do two decisions at the same time, what this implies, and I'm not going to explain this diagram in the interest of time, but there's a bottleneck in the brain that means that you can't really make two decisions at the same time. So it could be that for choice overload, decisions take time. The more decisions you're trying to make take more time in an additive way, and time is costly. So deciding not to decide may be the rational choice. In fact, it's a way that animals ultimately trade off their speed accuracy, and how we do too when we are actually performing optimally. The second answer I would put this way. It's a little bit different. So it's that the rational brain, very rational under the hood, under the skull, slips on its tail. And by tail I mean its storytelling abilities, its narrative. Okay? And that is a consequence of consciousness. Now, in the remaining minute, I'll have to tell you how consciousness works, and I'm going to do it. Okay, but first, let me give you an example of what this problem is. So, this is a famous problem put forth by Kahneman and Tversky, that Linda is a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy, and as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. And then you're asked a series of questions, and I'll give you the two on the list. One, Linda's a bank teller, and the other one, Linda's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Which of these two do you think is most likely? Okay, answer it yourself, or just in your head. And now I'll tell you the answer. It's got to be that Linda's a bank teller, because the probability of two things, bank teller and feminist, has to be less than the probability of one, because probabilities multiply when there are two things happening, and if they multiply, and probabilities are always somewhere between 0 and 1, they can only get to be a smaller number. Now, a lot of people make mistakes. I bet you none of you made this mistake. And if you want to read more about the whole variety of ways that we're irrational in decision making, including doctors on medical problems, you can read the papers by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, or Danny has this beautiful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and I also recommend this an easy read by the guy that wrote Moneyball. Okay, so I'm going to claim that this comes from storytelling, as I mentioned, but storytelling is a property of our consciousness. And I can tell it to you in about 30 seconds. So, you know, we said before that this knowledge, gnosis, has the structure of an interrogation in the form of might I? Might I reach for this? Might I hold my hand a certain way if I'm going to grab something? Might I mate with this? Might I eat this? Might I avoid this toxin? And so forth. We don't have to do these things, but we're organizing the information from memory and from the senses so that they bear on those kinds of decisions. Now, consider the following. This guy is about to grab this drill. And this drill affords a lot of possible things to him, like how he would grab it, how he would which hand he should move, how he would maybe move it along the table. Maybe he's going to put a hole in the wall with it. All the kinds of things that he would do with this drill is his knowledge of the drill. Okay? He has a knowledge of the back of the drill that's occluded by the front of the drill from his point of view. But now, let's imagine there's another person in the room. This woman, she also has knowledge of this drill, and she also has all those kind of affordance knowledge. She could grab it, she could drill a hole in it, maybe she could use it as a weapon even, you know, who knows? Lots of things you could do with a drill, not that you should. Now, both of these people have one special kind of an affordance, or one special kind of thing they could do, one special might I, the thing we could fill in the blank, and that's to report to another agent. Everything in the world, every event in the world is potentially reportable to another agent. And when we consider the report, now we're not thinking about aspects of the drill like where it is in the visual field or how heavy it might be or how you'd hold your hand to grab it. You're actually considering that it exists in the mind of another, sort of independent of yourself. So the drill has a presence in the world independent of me. I like to call that deriving Plato's essences, okay? So suddenly, that's how we know the world consciously. It's just because our brain engaged the world, just as it might engage the world with a potential eye movement, it engages it with a potential report. Now, potential reports have the content of narrative, of storytelling. The drill had an origin. It was purchased at some point, maybe, whatever. You know, the world has an origin, like we make up stories, like God or something made it. You know, so that's what's so important to us about consciousness. We can teach things to our children, and by having that ability, we can solve problems that would be very hard to solve using probability theory, like medical diagnosis or even navigation across seas and so forth. So this is very important to our culture. It probably means we're going to blow up the world and make it melt or burn. But for the time being, we view consciousness as a good thing. And that's what leads to our irrationality, and it's actually the irrationality of the slow brain that is the one that lets us tell stories. So I'll stop and just give you some closing points, just really for the teachers and students in the group, which is that knowledge is. I want to just press on you that knowledge is attained through a process of interrogation. So in a sense, we must learn how to interrogate, not just the facts. So we, as teachers, and that's what that we do too, is we are teaching really the tools to acquire. And for the students, you want to hone and acquire new skills because you see the world differently, because you ask different questions of the world with the new tools that you possess. And with that, I'll thank you and mention that many people do the work in my lab, and in fact, much more work than I do, and thank my funders.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shetland, for this fascinating talk. For our audience members, please remember that if you have any questions, use the Q&A button and we will try and answer your questions after the second talk. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Sheena Iyengar. Dr. Sheena Iyengar is a world expert on choice and decision-making, and we're very lucky to have her here at this event today. Her book, The Art of Choosing, received the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year 2010 award and was ranked #3 on the Amazon Best Business and Investing Books of 2010. Her TED Talks have collectively received almost 4 million views, and her research continues to inform markets, businesses, and individuals around the world. Dr. Iyengar is the inaugural S.T. Lee Professor of Business at Columbia University. Growing up in New York City as a blind Indian American and a daughter of immigrants, she began to look at the choices she and others had and how to get the most from choice. She first started researching choice as an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. She received her PhD in social psychology from Stanford University. In 2011 and 2019, she was named a member of the Thinkers 50, a global ranking of the top 50 management thinkers. She won the Dean's Award for Outstanding Core Teaching from Columbia Business School in 2012. In a groundbreaking new course called Think Bigger, Dr. Iyengar created a 6-step method for teaching people how to take advantage of lessons learned from neurological and cognitive science to put our minds to work when generating our best ideas. Her new book is entitled Think Bigger, and it will be released soon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Iyengar to the virtual stage for her talk, How to Think Bigger.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a warm introduction, and I loved your talk, Michael, and we have a lot to talk about. One thing I will say is, building on what Michael said, one of the tips that I often give people when making choices is I say you have to be choosy about choosing, which is exactly what Michael was talking about. So let's start by me showing you a picture of a famous sculpture. Do you know who she is? Of course, that is a rhetorical question. Now I want to tell you a little more about how we think about her. So I'm going to turn on a video.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
The Statue of Liberty is not just a statue. The Statue of Liberty is not just a piece of art. The Statue of Liberty is not just a tourist attraction to which close to 4 million people come and visit. The Statue of Liberty is not just the symbol that greets us as we're on a plane flying over New York or into New York. She's not just the statue that so many immigrants encountered as they landed in the United States. She is, by the very nature of that story that is told in that poem, a symbol that has come to mean so much. She's come to mean such abstract concepts like freedom, democracy, hope, opportunity, the power of imagination and dreaming. She is something that means something that's at once common to all of us that see her and yet feels very personal to each of us. It's how I would describe a big idea. That Lady Liberty is a big idea. She's more than simply the content or substance that makes her physical being. The question I want to ask tonight is, how do you get a big idea? Where do they come from? How did Frederick Bartholdi come up with the idea of making Lady Liberty? You could tell the story by describing Frederick Bartholdi as a hero on a hero's journey. He was an idealist. He had a dream. He had this dream when he was really young, around 21 years of age, when he went to Egypt. He wanted to make a colossal statue, much like those colossal monuments that guarded the ancient Egyptian tombs. In fact, he tried to make one of those. He put in an application to make a beautiful statue that would sit there in the Suez Canal. He was turned down, though, and instead they decided to build a very simple lighthouse. He was crushed. But then later, when there was an opportunity to build a statue commemorating the 100 years of freedom in the United States, the idealism kicked in and he fought hard and he managed to collect lots of money from the French to build the statue. And then again, he had to be determined and collect lots of money here in New York and Philadelphia to finally build the pedestal upon which the Lady Liberty stands. So that's one story. Of course, I could also tell you that he was a pragmatist and happened to be at the right place and at the right time. After all, his best friend, a man by the name of Edouard de la Boulaye, was a real activist at the time. He was anti-Napoleon and his descendants, and he wanted to restore faith in the French for French democracy and freedom. After all, as you know, the French were going through their own tumultuous period at that time. And so he saw an opportunity when America was about to have its 100-year celebration of freedom and democracy. And he just happened to be good friends with this artist, this sculptor called Frederick Bartholdi, and said, hey, why don't you make this statue? He was the right man for the right moment. So notice how I could tell his story from the perspective of an idealist, or I could tell his story from the perspective of the pragmatist. As an idealist, we think of him as a man with a dream, with a vision, who persisted against all the odds. As a pragmatist, we would say he adapted to the opportunities that confronted him, and he was flexible and open-minded. And of course, both of these stories are at least partially true, but they don't really tell us, how did he get the idea? He needed both of these mindsets, but how did he get the idea? Where did the actual idea come from? Well, let's take Lady Liberty apart and divide her up into her various pieces. Well, we know that her colossal image comes from his inspiration that he got from looking at those Egyptian monuments guarding the ancient Egyptian tombs. But what about the rest? Well, in the 1860s, a very famous painter in France at that time was a man by the name of Lefebvre, who just happened to have a very famous painting called La Vérité, the Lady of Truth. Notice the pose. Well, there was also the seal of France at the time, and there was also this interesting picture that was on the 5-franc note at that time in France. Notice the crown, Libertas, from the Roman period. And what about the face of the Statue of Liberty? You know, we're told he had a very close relationship with his mother, who became a widow when he was 2. You put all these pieces together, her face, the pose from La Verite, Libertas, and don't forget Egypt. And you create a combination. Everything was familiar, and yet, even though I have torn apart Lady Liberty, I suspect you're still mesmerized by the whole. She's a creative combination. Just as Schumpeter told us in the 1900s, what is innovation? And I'll simplify now, but a new combination of old ideas. It's creative combination, and that's well recognized. When we say, what is innovation? We answer, it's creative combination. And of course, the Gestalt psychologist built on that and said, no, an aha moment is more than just the sum of the pieces that come together. The whole is much greater. But where do we get these creative combinations? You know, psychologists and more recently neuroscientists have puzzled over this. Freud told us that these ideas come to us in our unconscious, perhaps in our dreams, in our sleep. And then more recent neuroscientists talk about the benefits of mind wandering, because after all, we can solve so many of our problems when we're maybe on a jog or taking a nap or doing some other mindless activity. All of these ways of thinking about where creative combination comes from assume that it's out of our control, that it's all magic, that somehow spontaneously the brain does its magical work and we just get these combinations. And certainly these periods of mindless wandering are helpful, and I don't want to discourage you from doing that important jog or taking a nap. Certainly you need your mind to be at rest. But I want to suggest to you that we can do so much better when teaching people how to solve complex problems. That creative combination is not something that you have to think of as being uncontrollable or out of your reach. That if anything, modern day neuroscience, the study of learning and memory and the study of cognitive biases teaches us how to be more prescriptive about solving problems. That in fact, we can apply the knowledge that we have gained from the last 30 odd years and create a more prescriptive model for how to teach people how to do creative combination. So let's think about what we've learned from learning and memory and neuroscientists like Eric Kandel and others. The way you can think of learning and memory is our minds are like a library system. We're constantly collecting information nodes and putting them onto different shelves in our memory bank. Sure, we're not democratic in the way we store and retrieve information. We're bias-making machines for sure. But every time I ask you a question, like what's 2 + 2, or come up with a word that doesn't exist right now that rhymes with airplane, you go into your memory bank and you pull out different information bits and you connect them and you form a thought. And that's how we do all kinds of activities, whether we're doing analytical activities or creative activities, we're using the same process. Well, certainly, if you look at all the great innovators throughout time, artists, inventors, scientists, philosophers, no matter whom you pull up, entrepreneurs, they do this process of taking different pieces that they have in their mind, connecting them in a new way. They engage in what some have called combinatory play, and they come up with a grand idea. And of course, you can't have a grand idea if you don't have the pieces in your brain at the time. But this process that we've always assumed to be subconscious, I believe we can make more deliberative, more conscious. And in the process, perhaps make it even less biased. So I want to describe to you a tool that I have been creating for the past several years and have been teaching to MBA students And I've now taught it to thousands of students, and I want to briefly share it with you. I call it the choice map. And I call the method of coming up with new ideas choice mapping. And of course, you would expect nothing less than the word choice from somebody who spent her entire career studying choice. So I'm going to walk you through what a choice map is and what is choice mapping in the very brief amount of time I have left. So here's what it is. Think of it as a 5x5. Sure, you can make it smaller or bigger, but not too much bigger because we do have cognitive limitations in information and choice processing. Here's what's at the top. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And just like Michael said, you have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to frame that problem. Because as Einstein said, if I had an hour to save the planet, I would spend the first 55 minutes defining and understanding the problem. You then take that problem and you break it down into the most important subparts of the problem, which go along the left column. And now in each row, you fill up each row with examples of how that problem has been solved in history by others in the present and in the past. But when I say solved, I don't just mean solved in your domain of expertise. Your domain of expertise is only in the first column. Every other column that makes up this choice map should be drawing from the way people from other domains, other disciplines have solved this problem. That's how you get real interdisciplinary thought. And so you create a choice map where it's filled with at least 5 different examples of how to solve the problem, 5 different tactics for each subpart. And notice how I'm very deliberately creating a blueprint for your mind to use as it's consciously combining. And so now you take each tactic per row and combine it with other tactics, 1 per row. Line them up in your head and ask yourself, what could I imagine creating? Now, of course, creative combination is not merely slapping them together and creating some Frankenstein. It is a little more elegant than that. And so it does require imagination as you combine these pieces, and that's where mind wandering can come in quite handy. And so that is choice mapping. Now, I've described it in brief, but it actually takes it's a skill like any other that has to be developed, and to do it well is an art. It's like going to the gym. Now, what I'm going to say in conclusion about the choice map and choice mapping is notice a few things here. It accounts for cognitive limitations. It made it 5x5. And I'm being very deliberate about how big we're going to make it. I'm also being very deliberate about what pieces go into it so that you are more diverse in what information bits you collect. Because I think being diverse in the informations you collect is key to what people often refer to as out-of-the-box thinking. I'm going to end with a quote by the great French polymath Henri Poincaré, who said, invention consists of avoiding the constructing of useless combinations and consists of the constructing of useful combinations, which are an infinite minority. To invent is to discern, is to choose. What I'm giving you here is a tool by which we can construct those most useful combinations that can solve complex problems, whether they be personal problems or big professional problems or even societal problems. This is how I believe out-of-the-box thinking can happen in a conscious way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyengar, for this thought-provoking talk. Now I will invite Dr. Shadlin to join us for a discussion where we will answer some of our audience's questions. Just briefly before we go into the discussion, I just wanted to mention that I have met both of our speakers prior to this event, and we agreed to address each other on a first-name basis. So Sheena and Mike, thank you so much again, both of you, for your fascinating talks today. So what stood out from your talks today was that the problem of decision-making in the human brain can be approached by looking at many different types of decisions, from relatively basic perceptual decisions all the way to out-of-the-box innovative ideas. And yet, despite studying these different types of decisions and using very unique research approaches, there were a lot of parallels between the insights that both of you provided. For example, both of you describe decision-making as an intentional and deliberate process that involves exploration. Both of you also mentioned that our decisions and ideas don't just sort of come out of nowhere, but they're strongly embedded in existing knowledge. Mike, you mentioned this idea of narratives, and Sheena, you talked about linking existing ideas in order to create new ones. And both of you also mentioned how that can be useful. However, we got a lot of audience questions about whether it can sometimes be problematic to use pre-existing knowledge or narratives or assumptions because they can be biased or suboptimal or straight up false and misleading. So how can we sometimes let go of these pre-existing assumptions or ideas that we already have in order to create something new? And Sheena, why don't you go first, and then Mike can respond to this.
So this is something I've thought a lot about, and I think that we should just acknowledge that as humans, we're all bias-making machines, and that the way to actually get the best quality decisions is to go into other disciplines. Now, it's actually not that easy to go into other disciplines because we all live in our own little silos. And we don't often know what questions to ask of people when we talk to them from different silos, which is why I said break it down into subparts. If you can break down your major problem into smaller parts of the problem, it's much easier to take it to people outside of your domain of inquiry. So as academics, other disciplines, as practitioners, to people that are in different industries, and you ask them, how have you solved this sort of a problem? And it's very important to talk to people that you don't know well and that are in very different other disciplines and maybe even looking into history to collect different tactics. You want the strategies that go into your row to be very different from one another in order that you diversify your choice set. So notice here how I'm not giving you a large choice set, but I want each of those choices to be meaningfully different from one another.
Wow, I agree with all that. I mean, it's I was going to start in with play, because the way children learn to ask questions outside the box, so to speak, using your language, is by playing together. I think that's why it's so important, and to explore non-capriciously, meaning not just casting bait to the wind, but there's something directed about every step we take, even when it seems like they're in random directions, and that allows us to learn from others how they approach similar problems. It might be climbing the jungle gym when we're kids, or whatever, or various horrible social ranking things as middle schoolers, or a bunch of other things that may not be good. I would also respond to the question by saying that yes, I mean, I'll say another thing. That is, I also definitely subscribe to the idea that interdisciplinary interaction is key, because it makes us think about problems from completely different angles. But that requires a lot of letting go, because I mean, it's very easy to be critical of things that are outside our own fields, but to sort of accept it for a little while, suspension of disbelief or whatever, as we do in the theater, and get to and kind of embrace another way. I love to do that with philosophy, and I find a lot of inspiration in music. But we have to remember that we do carry around those biases, and those biases are in some sense parochial, in the sense that we are somewhat bound by the things we know and the tools that we have at our disposal to explore. But they're also pernicious when they're biases that are negative in the in interactions in the community. Being aware of it, of course, is not the solution to the problem, but it's a start.
So then, talking about these interactions and their role in decision making, clearly we don't make decisions in isolation, but usually it happens within some social context. And in fact, a lot of the decisions that we make also have an impact on other people around us. How can we shift a decision maker's focus from only considering the outcomes for ourselves, but also consider the impact that our decisions and ideas have on other people around us? Yeah, if either of you have any thoughts on this, please go ahead.
Do you want to start, Sheena?
I'll let you go. I'll let you take this one.
Okay. So I mean, here's something that kind of bridges, is that if you follow my gist that consciousness really came from as a social affordance between human beings, I'm really in a way channeling the philosopher Martin Buber, who saw as, metaphysically the primacy of the between. We didn't grow up as individuals. We grew up, we evolved as groups. And so the crowdsourcing that also helps us get out of the box, and also the fact that our awareness, all of our consciousness is rooted in the theory that another mind is like mine, not exactly mine, but like it, and therefore grasps that drill that I showed you, in the same way that my mind does, is essentially already a kind of a form of empathy, sort of. I've never really thought of it this way exactly, but kind of an epistemological empathy, like we should, maybe that's just another way of saying theory of mind. But in any case, so I think we start with a leg up on that one, because all of our consciousness really began as a world that exists between human beings.
So maybe, Sheena, for you, I can follow up with a more specific question that some of the audience members had about how emotions or gut feeling play a role in thinking bigger or thinking creatively.
Yeah, so I think, so on the one hand, we like to think of bias, and we have come to see bias as a negative thing, right? Because it can make us not good at processing information in a democratic way. However, I think there is actually an upside to bias as well, in that your emotional response can be useful information in telling you what your goals are or what your ideals are. So there's a lot of times, right, when you have a difficult problem and you're trying to decide, let's say, should I work for an investment bank, or should I go save the world at this non-for-profit and be poor, right? Or, how do I, solve this complex problem? Which of these options that I've created would actually work? And a lot of times we have this way of getting caught up because we want to choose the option that is most functional or the most optimal in some way based on some socially sanctioned appropriate criteria. And yet that isn't something we're motivated by or want to do. So I do think that having that ability to surface whatever your emotional preferences are is actually useful to have. I wouldn't put it in the choice map, in that it's not a part of the creation of choices. You want that to be more democratic and diverse in information gathering. But in your selection of which options you're going to be motivated by, I think it is important to know what your emotions are.
Sort of a different type of question or different theme where we got a lot of questions is that, Mike, in your talk, you talked about this idea of having a provisional plan. what then turns such a provisional plan in the brain into an action that is actually carried out? And sort of related to Sheena's talk as well, what makes us decide that an idea that we have, or a certain combination of different ideas, is the optimal one, and that we, stick with that and pursue that over time instead of continuing to combine ideas and sort of ruminating or considering more and more options that are out there?
You want to go first, or you want me to go, Michael?
Go ahead, but I might need the question again. I might forget. Go on, Sheena.
So I described to you the choice map. I actually have another tool, which I didn't have time to go into, but I call it the desires triangle. And that's a separate tool that's all about surfacing what you want the ideal to feel like, what you want the ideal to feel like to whatever, other audiences you might have for whatever decision you're making. And it's triangulating on what those emotional preferences are. Now, that is the selection criteria. So notice how with the choice map, you can create infinite combinations. They're all by definition useful, because by definition, you're solving for all of the main subparts of your problem. But clearly some will be more preferred than others. And that's where your biases come in. You use your desires to decide which one is more preferred versus less preferred.
For Mike, for you, the more specific question maybe related to your talk is, you had this idea of provisional plans in the brain. At what point does the brain decide, I'm going to carry this out as an action, instead of only having it as a provisional plan?
Great. I think it depends on the context. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that I insert that word provisional just as a way to guard against the idea that you have to act. But to really make the point that we organize information in accordance to the ways, plural, that we would act, but it's provisional. So it could be that we're waiting for the starter to shoot the pistol or whatever they do, so that to get out of the blocks. So we're waiting for that. We're prepared, and or it may be that we're waiting for something very special in the world to occur. And that's the time that we're going to, take up arms and whatever we're supposed to do now. Whatever, so even though we might have engaged our politics in such a way that we were thinking in very, maybe even violent terms, but we didn't, I really can't stand going through this particular example. I heard some podcast about eco-terrorism just now, and so I have all of these terrorist ideas on my mind, but they're only provisional. I'm not going to act on them. Nothing will get me to do something violent. But anyway, that's an example. So the idea is we organize information in accordance in the way we would interrogate the world as if we were embodying some kind of thing we would do, and we don't ever have to do it. And then the kinds of things that make us actually do whatever it is might be something as simple as a starter's pistol. It might be the time that the drummer hits the one, and that's where we wanted to come down on the side to execute the note I had in mind. Just take the much more pacifist and artistic example than terrorism, and or in the case of taking up arms, I don't know, something in the news.
Michael, can you riff on what you just said?
Can you? Of course.
So think of it this way. Here's how I would think of it in more simplistic terms. Let's imagine that you're thinking so-and-so is hot. Right? You can't reason your way into knowing if somebody's hot or not. It's only your emotions that's going to tell you hot, not hot. Your mom can't answer that question. Only your so-called gut answers that question. Should you act on the fact that you found this person hot? Well, you could, and in the morning you might ask yourself, oh my God, what was I thinking? And the answer to that is you weren't. And so one way to answer this question is to say, look, emotions might tell you what you want, but it doesn't tell you what you will want in the future. Doing some sort of an analysis or information processing exercise can tell you what you should want, but it won't tell you what you will want. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have a situation where both your emotions and your information processing exercise are telling you, oh my God, this is it, just do it.
I really hate to already interrupt the discussion at this point, but we are unfortunately already out of time for today. I hope this is a sort of a good point to finish here. Thank you all so much for attending this event today. And thanks so much again to Mike and Sheena for sharing so many of your insightful thoughts with us today. Everyone in the audience, please take 2 minutes to fill out a survey that we will share with you in the chat. And please let us know your thoughts about today's event. We really appreciate any feedback. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rui for some final remarks.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sheena. What an evening. We could continue here this wonderful conversation. We hope you have enjoyed and that you'll join us on Thursday, November 4th for our next event in this series, where Dr. Nima Mesgarani and Nathan Copeland will discuss the science and the real-world impact of brain-machine interfaces, how our brains can connect directly to technology and control directly computers and devices. I hope you continue to stay healthy. Thank you again for your continuous support, and I hope you enjoy our programming. See you soon, November 4th. Thank you.